The fall of Babylon in 539 BCE stands as one of history's most stunning military achievements. When Cyrus the Great of Persia marched against the seemingly impregnable city, he brought with him an elite force that would become legendary, the Immortals. These warriors, numbering exactly 10,000 at all times, would help orchestrate one of antiquity's most decisive victories against a Babylonian force that vastly outnumbered them. The story of how this happened reveals not just military prowess, but a sophisticated understanding of psychological warfare, engineering, and the art of exploiting an enemy's weaknesses. The rise of two empires. To understand this pivotal confrontation, we must first examine the two powers that collided at Babylon's gates. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, under King Nabonidus and his son Belshazzar, represented the culmination of Mesopotamian civilization. Babylon itself was the jewel of the ancient world, protected by walls so massive that chariots could race along their tops. The Greek historian Herodotus would later describe these fortifications with awe, noting walls that stretched for miles and stood hundreds of feet high. The city's defenses seemed insurmountable. The Euphrates River flowed directly through Babylon's center, providing both water and a natural moat. Massive gates controlled access, and the city's granaries held enough food to withstand a siege lasting years. The Babylonian military, though not as battle-hardened as it had been under Nebuchadnezzar II, still numbered in the tens of thousands. Contemporary estimates suggest the garrison and available troops defending Babylon and its approaches may have reached 80,000 men or more. Against this stood Cyrus the Great, a ruler who had already proven himself a military genius. Starting from the relatively modest kingdom of Anshan in modern-day Iran, Cyrus had unified the Median and Persian peoples, conquered the wealthy kingdom of Lydia in Anatolia, and was systematically building what would become the largest empire the world had yet seen. His secret weapon was not just his tactical brilliance, but an elite fighting force that embodied Persian military excellence: the Immortals. The Immortals, an unprecedented fighting force. The Persian Immortals were unlike any military unit that had come before. Their very name spoke to their most distinctive characteristic. The corps always numbered exactly 10,000 men. Whenever a soldier fell in battle, died of disease, or became too old to serve, he was immediately replaced. To outside observers, it appeared that these warriors could never be diminished, that they were literally immortal. But the Immortals were far more than a clever propaganda tool. They represented the pinnacle of Persian military organization and training. Each warrior was selected from the finest soldiers in the empire, chosen for physical prowess, courage, and absolute loyalty to the king. They underwent rigorous training that transformed them into a cohesive fighting machine capable of executing complex maneuvers with precision. The equipment of an immortal reflected both practicality and intimidation. Unlike the heavily armored Greek hoplites who would later face them, Immortals wore relatively light armor consisting of scaled or quilted fabric that allowed for mobility while still providing reasonable protection. Their primary weapon was the spear, but each warrior also carried a short sword and was skilled with the bow. This versatility meant they could fight effectively in multiple formations and adapt to changing battlefield conditions. The organization of the Immortals was equally sophisticated. They were divided into units of 10, 100, and 1,000, with a clear command structure that allowed for rapid communication and coordination. The first 1,000 of the 10,000 formed the king's personal bodyguard and were distinguished by golden pomegranates decorating their spear butts, while the remaining 9,000 carried silver pomegranates. This elite within the elite provided an additional layer of security for the Persian monarch and served as shock troops in critical moments. What truly set the Immortals apart was not just their individual skill or equipment, but their discipline and cohesion. Ancient warfare was often chaotic, with formations breaking down once battle was joined. The Immortals maintained their structure even in the heat of combat. They could advance in tight formation, wheel and maneuver as a unit, and execute tactical retreats without dissolving into a mob. This discipline multiplied their effectiveness many times over. The strategic situation. By 539 BCE, Cyrus had spent years consolidating his power and preparing for the confrontation with Babylon. He understood that this would not be a simple military campaign. Babylon was more than just another city to conquer. It was the symbolic and economic heart of Mesopotamia. Taking it would require more than brute force. The political situation worked in Cyrus's favor. King Nabonidus had alienated much of Babylon's priesthood and population through his religious reforms. Unlike previous Babylonian kings, who had honored the traditional patron god Marduk and participated in the annual New Year festival, Nabonidus had promoted the moon god Sin and spent years away from the capital in the Arabian desert. This created resentment among the powerful priestly class and uncertainty among the common people. Cyrus, ever the shrewd politician, recognized this opportunity. He began a propaganda campaign portraying himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror. He claimed that Marduk himself had called upon him to free Babylon from Nabonidus's neglect. This message found receptive ears among those disillusioned with the current regime. However, Cyrus also understood that propaganda alone would not open Babylon's gates. The city's fortifications remained formidable, and its garrison, though perhaps not as motivated as they might have been, still numbered in the tens of thousands. A direct assault would be costly and might fail entirely. Cyrus needed a plan that combined military force with cunning. The campaign begins. Cyrus's campaign against Babylon unfolded in stages, each designed to weaken the enemy and position his forces for the final blow. He began by securing the surrounding territories, cutting off Babylon's access to reinforcements and supplies. Persian forces, including detachments of the Immortals, swept through the Mesopotamian countryside, taking towns and cities with a combination of force and diplomacy. Many cities surrendered without a fight once they learned of Cyrus's reputation for clemency toward those who submitted peacefully. This was another of Cyrus's innovations in ancient warfare. He understood that showing mercy to defeated enemies could be more effective than terror in building an empire. Cities that surrendered retained their local governance and religious practices, while those that resisted faced destruction. As the Persian net tightened around Babylon, a decisive battle occurred at Opis on the Tigris River. Here, the Immortals and other Persian forces engaged a large Babylonian army sent to stop Cyrus's advance. The details of this battle are fragmentary, but the outcome was clear. The Babylonians suffered a crushing defeat. Ancient sources speak of massive casualties, with bodies reportedly clogging the river itself. The Battle of Opis showcased the Immortals' effectiveness in open warfare. The Babylonian forces, though numerically superior in the theater, found themselves unable to match the Persians' discipline and tactical flexibility. When the Babylonians attempted to form a defensive line, the Immortals' archers peppered them with arrows, disrupting their formation. When the Babylonians charged, the Immortals' spearmen met them with a wall of steel, their tight formation holding against the assault. Persian cavalry, working in coordination with the Immortals, swept around the Babylonian flanks, threatening to encircle them. The Babylonian commanders, lacking the coordination and training of their opponents, struggled to respond to these multiple threats simultaneously. As their formations began to waver, the Immortals pressed their advantage, pushing forward with relentless pressure until the Babylonian lines broke entirely. The defeat at Opis was catastrophic for Babylon. It destroyed the field army that might have challenged Persian control of the surrounding territory and left the city isolated. Now Cyrus could focus his entire force on Babylon itself, with the Immortals as the core of his assault force. The siege that wasn't. When Cyrus arrived before Babylon's walls, he faced a daunting prospect. The city's fortifications were legendary, and within its walls were perhaps 80,000 defenders with supplies to last for years. A conventional siege could drag on indefinitely, and even if it succeeded, it would come at an enormous cost in Persian lives. But Cyrus had no intention of fighting a conventional siege. The Immortals and the bulk of his army took up positions around the city, maintaining the blockade and preventing any relief forces from approaching. However, the real action was happening elsewhere, away from the city walls where defenders could observe. Cyrus had identified Babylon's greatest strength and turned it into a vulnerability. The Euphrates River, which flowed through the city, provided water and a means of internal transport. But it also represented a potential entry point. The question was how to exploit it. Persian engineers, working under Cyrus's direction, began a massive project upstream from Babylon. They excavated a canal system designed to divert the Euphrates from its natural course. This was an enormous undertaking, requiring thousands of workers and careful planning. The work was done far enough from the city that Babylonian scouts could not easily observe or interfere with it. Meanwhile, the Immortals and other units maintained pressure on Babylon's defenses. They conducted regular probing attacks, testing the walls at different points, forcing the defenders to remain alert and spread their forces. These attacks served multiple purposes. They gathered intelligence about the defenses, kept the Babylonians focused on the walls rather than the river, and prevented them from sallying forth to investigate Persian activities in the surrounding countryside. The psychological aspect of facing the Immortals cannot be understated. Babylonian defenders, looking down from their walls, saw an enemy force that seemed never to diminish. Day after day, the same number of warriors stood ready. Casualties from skirmishes seemed to have no effect. This apparent immortality was designed to be demoralizing, and it worked. The defenders knew they faced not just an army, but a legend. The cunning plan unfolds. As the Persian engineers completed their work on the canal system, Cyrus prepared for the next phase. He had to choose his timing carefully. The operation would require coordination between multiple elements of his force, and it had to happen when the Babylonians least expected it. Cyrus selected a night when Babylon was engaged in a major religious festival. According to both Greek and Babylonian sources, the city was celebrating, with feasting and drinking throughout. This was not mere chance. Cyrus had intelligence networks within the city feeding him information about such opportunities. His propaganda campaign had borne fruit, and there were those in Babylon sympathetic to the Persian cause, or at least opposed to Nabonidus. As night fell and the festivities began, Persian engineers opened the canals. The Euphrates, which had flowed through Babylon for millennia, began to drop. This happened gradually at first, then more rapidly, as the full flow diverted into the new channels. Within hours, the river running through the city had dropped to fordable levels. Cyrus had divided the Immortals and his assault force into two groups. One positioned itself at the point where the Euphrates entered the city walls, the other where it exited. Both locations were fortified with gates and defenses, but these were designed to prevent attacks from outside the walls, not from the riverbed itself. As the water level dropped sufficiently, the Immortals moved. They descended into the riverbed, their approach masked by darkness and by the sounds of celebration echoing through the city. This was a moment that could have gone catastrophically wrong. If the Babylonians had noticed the dropping water level in time, if they had adequately guarded the river gates, if the water had not dropped enough, the entire force could have been trapped and destroyed in the riverbed. But the combination of careful planning, timing, and the Babylonians' overconfidence in their defenses paid off. The Immortals advanced through the riverbed, moving with the discipline and silence that their training had instilled. They approached the river gates from the inside, where defenses were minimal. The assault. The first indication that something was wrong came when Babylonian guards at the river gates suddenly found themselves facing Persian warriors emerging from the darkness of the riverbed. The surprise was total. Before an effective alarm could be raised, the Immortals had secured these critical entry points. The discipline of the Immortals now proved decisive. Rather than dissolving into looting or random violence, they maintained their formation and purpose. One contingent secured the gates and worked to open them fully, allowing more Persian forces to enter. Another moved swiftly into the city, heading for key objectives: the palace, administrative buildings, and the main city gates. The Babylonian defenders, many of whom were engaged in the festival celebrations, struggled to respond to this sudden threat from within. The command structure, with King Nabonidus absent — he was in another city — and Prince Belshazzar in charge, proved inadequate to the crisis. Orders were confused or contradictory. Units tried to respond, but found themselves facing disciplined Persian forces already in control of key locations. The Immortals' training in urban combat now came into play. Fighting in a city is fundamentally different from open battle. The narrow streets, dead ends, and buildings create a complex environment where small units can hold off much larger forces if they control the right positions. The Immortals broke into smaller tactical groups, each with clear objectives, each capable of independent action while remaining coordinated with the overall plan. As more Persian forces poured into the city through the now open river gates and the main gates that had been taken from the inside, the situation became increasingly hopeless for the defenders. Babylonian units trying to organize resistance found themselves outmaneuvered and overwhelmed. The Immortals, fighting in the close quarters of urban combat, used their combination of spear and sword to devastating effect. The superior organization and communication of the Persian forces meant that they could concentrate overwhelming force at critical points while the Babylonians remained dispersed and confused. When Babylonian troops gathered in the open spaces and squares to form defensive positions, they found themselves facing coordinated Persian assaults from multiple directions. The psychological impact of facing the Immortals in the chaos of night fighting cannot be overstated. These were the warriors whose reputation preceded them, who appeared to be undefeatable. Many Babylonian soldiers, already demoralized by previous defeats and uncertain about their leadership, chose to surrender or flee rather than fight to the death. The fall of Belshazzar. The climax of the battle came at the royal palace. Prince Belshazzar, according to tradition, was hosting a feast when word reached him of the Persian incursion. The biblical account in the book of Daniel describes a scene of revelry interrupted by mysterious writing on the wall, prophesying doom. While the supernatural elements of this story are matters of faith rather than history, the core truth seems accurate. Belshazzar and his court were caught completely by surprise. A contingent of Immortals, likely including elements of the royal guard unit, fought their way to the palace. The defenders there, including Belshazzar's personal guards, mounted a more determined resistance. These men, stationed at the center of power and directly loyal to the royal family, could not simply surrender or flee. A fierce battle ensued in the palace halls and chambers. The fighting was brutal and close quarters. In these conditions, the Immortals' training and equipment proved optimal. Their lighter armor allowed for mobility in tight spaces, while their combination of weapons meant they could adjust to different fighting situations moment by moment. When facing massed defenders in a hallway, they used spears in tight formation. In individual combat through chambers and corridors, they drew swords. the outcome was never really in doubt. The palace defenders were isolated, cut off from any support, and facing an enemy force that had already taken control of most of the city. According to ancient sources, Belshazzar was killed during this fighting, though the exact circumstances of his death vary in different accounts. With Belshazzar's death and the palace secured, organized resistance in Babylon effectively ended. Some pockets of defenders continued fighting, either unaware that the city had fallen or determined to fight to the death regardless. But the Immortals and other Persian forces methodically cleared these remaining strong points. By dawn, Persian banners flew over Babylon's walls and towers. The city that had never been successfully besieged, whose fortifications were considered the strongest in the world, had fallen in a single night. And it had fallen not through the slow starvation of a prolonged siege, but through a combination of engineering, tactics, and the devastating effectiveness of 10,000 elite warriors. The aftermath and legacy. In the wake of the conquest, Cyrus demonstrated why he would be remembered as the Great. Rather than sacking Babylon, burning its temples, and enslaving its population, as was common practice in ancient warfare, Cyrus pursued a policy of reconciliation and restoration. He immediately issued a declaration, later recorded on what became known as the Cyrus Cylinder, proclaiming himself the legitimate king of Babylon, chosen by Marduk himself. He promised to restore the temples, return displaced peoples to their homelands, including the Jews who had been in Babylonian captivity, and respect local customs and religions. This political genius ensured that Babylon transitioned from enemy to loyal subject with minimal ongoing resistance. The Immortals, having played such a crucial role in the conquest, were returned to their barracks and resumed their duties as the Persian Empire's elite force. Their reputation, already formidable, was now enhanced by their success at Babylon. They would continue to serve as the shock troops of the Persian Empire for generations, facing Greeks at Marathon and Thermopylae, fighting in Egypt and Central Asia. The fall of Babylon marked a turning point in ancient history. It ended the Neo-Babylonian Empire and established Persian dominance over Mesopotamia. More importantly, it demonstrated new possibilities in warfare and empire building. Cyrus showed that an empire could be built and maintained not just through terror and destruction, but through a combination of military excellence and political accommodation. Military lessons and innovations. The conquest of Babylon offers numerous lessons that remained relevant throughout military history. First, Cyrus understood that the most formidable fortifications could be circumvented through engineering and cunning rather than direct assault. The diversion of the Euphrates was an engineering feat that demonstrated how natural features, often seen as defensive advantages, could be turned against defenders. Second, the operation showcased the value of elite, well-trained forces capable of complex operations. The Immortals did not simply fight bravely, they executed a sophisticated plan that required stealth, coordination, and adaptability. Their ability to transition from approach march through the riverbed to urban assault to palace fighting demonstrated versatility that numerically superior but less well-trained forces could not match. Third, Cyrus's integration of psychological warfare, propaganda, and military force created conditions where the actual fighting was less costly for both sides. By undermining Babylonian morale and leadership before the assault, by offering clemency to those who surrendered, and by choosing the timing of his attack to maximize confusion, Cyrus achieved victory with relatively little bloodshed compared to what a prolonged siege might have required. The coordination between different elements of the Persian force, engineers, intelligence operatives, the Immortals, and regular troops, represented a level of joint operations that was unusual for the ancient world. This required not just good planning, but also reliable communications, a clear command structure, and subordinate commanders capable of exercising initiative within the overall plan. The Immortals in historical context. The Persian Immortals represented one of several attempts in ancient history to create truly professional military forces. Unlike the citizen soldiers of Greek city-states or the feudal levies common in many societies, the Immortals were full-time professional warriors selected and trained specifically for their role. This professionalism gave them advantages that went beyond individual martial skill. They could be trained in complex tactics that would be impossible to teach to farmers called up for a single campaign. They could maintain their equipment to a higher standard, ensuring that every warrior's gear was reliable and well-maintained. They could develop unit cohesion and trust that comes only from extended service together. The concept of maintaining a fixed number through immediate replacement was brilliant, both practically and psychologically. Practically, it meant that the unit's combat power remained consistent, never degrading due to casualties or aging. Psychologically, it created an aura of invincibility that preceded them into battle, weakening enemy morale before combat even began. The Immortals also served an important political function within the Persian Empire. As an elite force personally loyal to the king and drawn from across the empire's territories, they helped bind together the diverse peoples under Persian rule. Service in the Immortals was prestigious, and having warriors from different regions serving together created connections that reinforced imperial unity. Why numbers alone don't determine victory? The conquest of Babylon illustrates a fundamental military principle. Numerical superiority does not guarantee victory. The Babylonians had roughly 8 times as many defenders as there were Immortals in the assault force, yet they were defeated decisively. Several factors explain this outcome. First, the Babylonians' numerical advantage was largely negated by their strategic situation. Spread across the vast circuit of Babylon's walls and throughout the city, they could not bring their full force to bear at the critical points where the Immortals struck. Meanwhile, the Persians could concentrate their forces at selected locations, creating local superiority despite their overall numerical disadvantage. Second, training and discipline multiply a force's effectiveness, exponentially, not linearly. 10 well-trained, coordinated soldiers are not merely twice as effective as 5. They may be 4 or 5 times as effective. They can execute complex maneuvers, maintain formation under pressure, and support each other in ways that untrained troops cannot. The Immortals' training meant that each one was worth several ordinary soldiers in combat effectiveness. Third, the quality of leadership matters enormously. Cyrus was personally directing operations, making real-time decisions based on intelligence and changing conditions. The Babylonian command structure, with Nabonidus absent and Belshazzar unprepared for this type of crisis, could not respond effectively. Good leadership maximizes a force's potential. Poor leadership squanders even numerical advantages. Finally, the initiative lay entirely with the Persians. They chose when and where to strike, under what conditions, with what forces. The Babylonians were reactive, responding to moves the Persians had already made. This initiative, combined with the surprise achieved through the river approach, meant that the battle was largely decided before most Babylonian forces even engaged. Conclusion: the victory that shaped history. The fall of Babylon in 539 BCE was not just another conquest in the violent history of the ancient world. It was a demonstration of how military excellence, strategic planning, and political sophistication could combine to achieve seemingly impossible objectives. The Immortals, Cyrus's elite 10,000, played a central role in this achievement. Their discipline, training, versatility, and tactical execution allowed them to overcome defenders who vastly outnumbered them. But they were tools in the hands of a master strategist who understood that victory comes not just from fighting well, but from creating the conditions where fighting becomes decisive. The legacy of this victory extended far beyond the immediate military outcome. It established the Persian Empire as the dominant power in the Near East for 2 centuries. It set patterns for how empires could be built and maintained that influenced Alexander the Great, the Romans, and countless others. The story of the Immortals and their role in Babylon's fall became legendary, inspiring military thinkers across millennia. For modern readers, the story offers insights that remain relevant. It reminds us that superior resources do not guarantee success. It demonstrates the value of careful planning and precise execution. It shows how elite forces, properly employed, can achieve objectives far beyond what their numbers might suggest. The conquest of Babylon stands as a testament to human ingenuity in warfare and to the profound impact that a small force of exceptional warriors can have when led by genius and employed with cunning. The Immortals and their king showed the ancient world that walls, however high, could be breached, that numbers, however great, could be overcome, and that a new kind of empire, built on both the sword and the olive branch, was possible.